The following program is an original production of WYCC PBS Chicago. Closed captioning for the professors is provided in part by the Clifford Law Offices, a personal injury and wrongful death law firm in Chicago.
Are we already seeing the beginning of the end for brick and mortar colleges and universities? Will students of the future even have to leave home to earn a college degree? That's the focus of our discussion today on The Professors. Joining us to talk about the end of the university as we know it are Connie Mixon, a professor at Elmhurst College, Barry Firestein, Chief Business Operating Officer at the University of Phoenix, Dr. Renee Robinson, a professor at St. Xavier University, and Nick Panamitros, attorney and professor at Kennedy King, UIC, and Harper Colleges. Welcome, everyone. All right, so we have 6 million students online now. A third of all college students are taking courses online. Some people think this is the most wonderful revolution in education that has occurred, and there are many people that obviously disagree with that. So I want to ask you, what do you all, before we even get into some of the nuances of the issue, what do you think? Is this a good trend or a bad trend?
Well, you know, Ted, you said, is this the end of the university? I don't think it's an either-or situation. I think it's both. I think both will continue to coexist.
Okay. So, for instance, I'll ask you a question then, because you work in an institution that is predominantly online, and you were telling me before the show began that for many of your students, they're non-traditional in the sense that it's providing opportunities for students that may not be in a traditional setting. Why don't you explain that to us, please?
Sure. I think it's not accurate to think about higher education in the U.S. as a homogeneous group. The typical 18 to 22-year-old set is what most people think of when they think about higher education. Those would be referred to as traditional students. The Department of Education actually has a set of risk factors that define traditional or non-traditional. Sure. So if the 18 to 22-year-old right out of high school to college is the traditional set, the non-traditional set would be more defined as working adults. And rough statistics are about 25% of the people in higher ed are traditional and 75% are non-traditional. Okay. And the whole market's about 20 million people in total.
And non-traditional, really talking about ages and that sort of thing.
Ages, risk factors, single parents, people who have been to school before, withdrew and gone back to school, anything that, anyone who's not a first-time, full-time college student.
Well, isn't that a good thing? I mean, don't we want more people to have access to higher education?
Yeah. At Elmhurst College, we've started the School for Professional Studies, or as we refer to it as the School for Busy People, exactly to fit that niche of non-traditional students. But we still have our core typical residential undergraduate programs.
And you know, it's something that has existed or has happened in the past. You know, once upon a time, getting to a school was a big deal. Before there was an automobile, people would have to take a horse or travel far, and then you had the automobile, urbanization,
That's not
centralization.
How you grew up, is it? No,
Not that old.
Okay.
But urbanization, and then universities being more accessible, and now you have it one step further where it's in your home. I mean, you can go on your computer and you can access, you can go to school actually while still being in your own home. So
now you have an interesting, I think, situation at work that you were sharing with us earlier, that you teach communications primarily, but you're going to be teaching a public speaking course online.
Correct, this June. And
so explain that, because how do you teach public speaking online?
I think that it's a fascinating time. Your initial question addressed this, or posed the question, is are these things in opposition? Is it good, is it bad to be online? I think we're all learning and trying to figure out what's the proper combination of those things. They don't necessarily exist in opposition. And so when you think of a course like public speaking, and if we're going to do that course online, what we have to consider then is what will that class provide students in a different experiential way? What will students see in that environment that they won't see in face-to-face? And what we know today is that much of our students, many of those students exist online. Shouldn't we be teaching them to think online, to speak online, to interact online? Well, how does that look? Okay. A lot of it looks in the form of social media. A lot of it looks in the way of being able to have video conference and these different ways of interacting in business settings and across. So that course will then morph into that.
But let me say this. So I've had the unique experience. I don't know if anyone here has had this yet, so maybe this make me a bit of an expert, a little bit on this, I don't know. But I've had the experience of actually teaching online and taking courses online during the past 10 years. So, and what I found was I actually really enjoyed being a student online. I didn't miss the connection with the other students. In fact, we had a lot of connections via email and that sort of thing. But I didn't necessarily like being a professor online because I did miss the connection with the students that way.
But you could have had that connection, though. That's the thing that
I don't know, though.
You can.
I mean, Facebook does not substitute for a social life.
No, but I
don't think that all online education substitutes for what happens in a classroom with students and the interaction that happens with professors. I don't think that you can entirely replace that. I think it works well for some students, for non-traditional students. I don't think it works well for necessarily all of your 18 to 22-year-olds, particularly students that come into college that are underprepared. I think that they need that face-to-face time and the interaction that can only happen in a classroom.
But you can still do it. I mean, it's just not being done. I've taught classes at the School of Public Health where I've done it the way you're talking, and taking classes the same, where it's just pretty much the material, you hand it in. But there was one occasion where I had the class on actually, and we were all able to see each other and have conversations. So I think some of it's the technology, and I think it's the next step is having that interaction. I think you can have it, and I think that's what you're going to have to do with your course. So we have to sort of develop that now as a next step.
Why don't you speak to that?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, this is clearly being enabled by technology. The growth of broadband, the access to broadband allows the content to be disseminated and people to teach in a much more interactive fashion. University of Phoenix has actually been teaching online for 20 years, but we started out primarily as a school that taught traditional classes on ground to working adults in the evenings for reasons of convenience and flexibility.
Yeah.
And that's changed now. It's changed for, I think, several underlying reasons. One is the generations that are growing up today, I will call them technology enabled. They grow up online. So they're much more comfortable with that learning environment. And two, you have another factor. You have the reason many schools are looking to promote online education is both because their students, if you will, their customers want it, but also because of an economic reality. And the economic reality is that student debt loads are at all-time highs.
They are.
And the question, I think, really is not a bricks and mortar sustainable, because I don't think anyone would deny the value of a classroom. I think the question really is the economic proposition of a traditional four-year school at round numbers, $40,000, $50,000 a year for some, is that sustainable for
Well, let me ask you a question, though, because you bring up a very good point about student debt, which is average students somewhere like $23,000 in debt. You mentioned, is the University of Phoenix cheaper than a traditional college? I don't think so. From what I've read, the for-profit schools are comparable in cost.
Yeah, they are. It's not a question of cheaper. No, our tuition for a bachelor's degree, round numbers, is about $15,000 a year in tuition. It's higher than in-state public institutions, and probably roughly comparable, maybe a little bit less than out-of-state rates. But it's still the question of, if you go to school full-time and you're living, if you're an 18-year-old and you get out of high school and you want to go somewhere and live full-time, when you factor in room and board, and if you're not working, the debt becomes significant. Okay. So I would boil it down to, and it'd be interesting to discuss, to me, it's a question of return on the investment. So if you're going to be an engineering student and your prospects for a job are clear and your starting salaries are known, then perhaps taking on debt is more sustainable than someone who might not be.
Yeah, which is, I mean, and that calculation is, I think, a tragic reality in education. There was a survey that was done in 1963 that asked college freshmen what was the #1 reason why they were going to school. And that survey came back, the students said the #1 reason was to gain a philosophy by which to live. The same survey was done in 1993 of college freshmen, and you can imagine what the response was. They wanted to get paid, they wanted to make money. And so what you're suggesting, I think it's disheartening to hear, to be honest with you, because I know going through college, I never really thought about what I was necessarily going to do financially when I got out. I wanted to learn. And yet our students have to make these decisions even before they walk into the class. And I think that's
I worry about the whole vocationalization of higher education, and the larger issue of what constitutes an educated person, what is an educated citizenry, and the value of liberal arts and general education, as opposed to a lot of these, what are they, massive open online course kind of things where students just pick
Right.
from here and there, you know, and they go straight into a career, they get some sort of certificate kind of thing.
And also the socialization part too. I mean, you're not interacting.
And that's huge. That's very, very important.
And does it matter as much when someone's 35? If the group is older, perhaps it's not as important. But if it's an 18 or 19, 20-year-old,
Right.
What does that do?
You want to respond to some
Yeah,
of
that's why I completely agree with what's being said. It's a very, very big difference between asking an 18-year-old to follow more of the European model, to say, tell us what you're going to do and we'll put you into a program, versus a working adult. So they're very different models. And my, what I was speaking about cost, my view of it is that people should just be aware of how they're going to pay for their degree. Not as course, not as semester. What's your degree going to cost you? Not a value judgment. Just be aware of how you're going to pay for it. If you can write the check and you have no debt, terrific. If you have to borrow, that's okay. Just understand the consequences of the debt service on repayment, because there's a staggering number of people now.
That's a whole other conversation. We got
Right.
some real issues with that. The level of default is at an all-time high as well. I wanted to come back to you for a moment, just on this hybrid question, because we're talking about socialization, and you teach courses that are a hybrid model. Why don't you explain that to us, please?
Sure. It requires an online interaction, a series of online activities that are rich experiences that really exploit the multimodal nature of a computer. If we're simply taking text from a book and putting that in an online context, that indeed doesn't constitute real learning necessarily. So we have to think, if we know the hallmarks of good teaching and learning deal with experiential learning and putting students in situations problem-based, then we need to mirror that. So what I do in my courses is I have the face-to-face, that socialization piece where students learn from peers and interact, but then they have a series of things they do online too. You hit on an excellent point, this notion of citizenship. What is our responsibility in teaching students today to be citizens? And our citizenship is changing demographically. We're looking at a number of diversity, I think, situations from class and technological use all the way over to the different kinds of careers that we're seeing. How are we as institutions of higher ed, as faculty, as administrators, as staff, working with our students to help them evolve into that? And I can't help but jump in on the flip side of what you're saying here. You bring up an excellent point, this issue of cost. And while students need to be assessing how much they're spending for that hybrid class, that online course, or face-to-face, what about our responsibility and the cost? And when I think of higher ed and I start to look at our experiences and I look at our administration and I look at tenure, it makes me question the entire process of what it is we're doing to help students. So while they're questioning their cost and what they can afford, it makes me question my own industry, if you will, the institution, as to what our responsibilities are there and a restructuring and reimagination.
Sure. Well, then that brings a very good point as well, because, you know, Connie, you mentioned this. You mentioned sort of the political side to this. You know, Connie, I think you had, well, I'm not going to say it's a conspiracy theory because there's a lot of evidence, right? No, it's very real. No, because, you know, I think we do have to question what these trends are. And I would argue that anything that gives more access to people to have education at a lower price, I think is a good thing. However, there's a dark side, if you will, to this.
And what I worry is that then we track, and that the liberal arts and the traditional residential experience becomes just for the wealthy because of these other opportunities, and then we start feeding lower income folks, mostly minorities, into these online vocational type training.
Yeah, which is happening.
And that's currently happening. And in general, there's an anti-education narrative out there.
Yes.
You heard it from Rick Santorum in the last presidential campaign. The negativity about higher education as it exists already. And when you look at those politicians, they're very eager to move to this all online. Well, you know what? It's cheaper and we can get rid of all those tenured faculty. We don't need them anyway. And we see that happening in the most conservative states across the country, that they're tearing down their existing brick and mortar university systems, or not tearing them down completely, but limiting them and offering more and more of the online opportunities.
And the economics just don't work. So
and state budgets, look at the deficits that states are carrying. And that
the overall number of people in higher education in the U.S. has been roughly the same at 20 million for a number of years. It goes up, it goes down a little bit. What's happening now is classic economics. You have a massive oversupply of seats, of the access to education, because of just what you were saying, Connie. People are offering online courses, so therefore 80% of students in higher ed today go to school within 100 miles of their home. It's been that way forever. With the access to online education, you can live here in Chicago and go to school in California. So what's going to happen over time when you have massive increases in supply and flat demand? prices will come down, which really gets to the sustainability of the model. And I think that's really at the heart of this is the model sustainable given debt loads, the shift to technology, the political headwinds, and then the desire for people to have access who are seeking this online modality.
You made a good point. You know, a couple of the elite East Coast institutions like Harvard are doing online programming, online courses, and these courses are opening up the door. Literally, they have courses that have thousands of students in them. When ordinarily you'd have a couple hundred students. And so, you know, this is changing, I think, the face of education. And the other side to this, because I've been involved in this debate for a while, being in higher education, you know, most of us in traditional colleges and universities are very, just to be honest, they've been very anti-for-profit schools, very anti-online schools. And yet the truth is that the trend is just happening regardless of whether we desire in the traditional institutions for it to happen or not. So really it's an issue of we probably just need to get on board.
Do we want corporations in the market to run education?
Well, I don't know that competition's always a bad thing. I mean, I don't necessarily, and I went to traditional schools. I teach at a traditional college in a sense, well, it's community college, it's somewhat traditional. But I don't necessarily, we've had this conversation on other shows about education. I don't think educational competition is always a bad thing. So even if that competition comes from the private sector, maybe at a minimum all it does
is there. The reality is it's there. We're not going back in time.
I wanted to bring in something different from the educator side. Talking about the hybrid courses, the ability to, you know, a lot of times, I'm sure, Ted, when you're in the classroom and you're teaching material, you feel like you're babysitting. Like they should have gotten this material out before we can have a higher conversation. And what I like about the online courses is that a lot of that material can be gotten out of the way so that when we are in the classroom, we can spend the time better. I mean, I've taught classes from anatomy to law to public health, and it's the same all over the place. A lot of times they don't have the basic vocabulary down, basic understandings, and I feel like I'm babysitting. And so if I can get this part out of the way online, then my use in the classroom is well spent. It's better for the student. They come less often. They'll feel like they're getting more out of it rather than me taking them by the hand and explaining them
And I think
things that
all
they
of
should
your
have gotten.
classroom instructors, whether they're doing hybrid courses or they're doing in-person classes, are making use of that technology.
I think it's wonderful, and I really think it's great for everybody.
Yeah, I think in different ways, but I think online isn't necessarily the answer there for making sure students get the content or have read. This is an age-old problem. My students don't read. My students aren't prepared for class. So whether that occurs in a face-to-face environment or whether it's online or hybrid, it's still a matter of, does the student have the skill set? Is the student able to prepare and engage? What about the notion of academic citizenship? What are we doing to socialize our students to understand what it is to learn? I don't necessarily see it being corporate or for-profit versus traditional community college, university, four-year, whatever settings. I see it as we each have a place that facilitates. One of the things I think that's left out of the article that we discussed about this end of the university as we know it, is this notion that as a culture in the United States especially, we've shifted towards a knowledge-based economy. And with that knowledge-based economy, we value not only information, but we value credentials and education and lifelong learning. You can't look at an institution of higher today that doesn't have a lifelong learning. You can't find a mission statement probably that deals with corporations that don't honor that. So when you think about how that looks at community colleges, 4 years, teaching, research, nonprofit, profit, whatever that is, this is where we're going to find our niches, and it's going to require a different kind of partnership to educate the citizenship.
Like this website, Coursera, which is, you know, it's funny because in preparation for the show, I was researching this, and actually I was 2 seconds from signing up for a course myself because it's free, it's online, and they have professors from all these universities teaching a variety of courses, and I said, man, that's really cool. I just want to learn a little bit about this subject, and I don't necessarily want to have a degree in it. To me, that makes sense. To me, that contributes to lifelong learning, and I think that's a good thing in many ways. And so I agree with the assessment that it's not sort of an either or, but we do have to recognize the shift is happening. In 2002, something like 9% of students were online. Now it's over 30% and rising.
And it's not, the statistic's a little dangerous. It's students are taking some courses online. They're not fully online. Yes, and so, but 80% of the schools offer some form of online course, and the percentage of students taking some percentage of their curriculum online is absolutely growing.
What about the stigma? Because there is a stigma about online education. I mean, it just is, right?
Yeah, I wanted to say something about that.
I think it was.
One of the beefs, and it has to do with the stigma, is a lot of times exams are given online, and it's sort of on good faith, or papers are handed in. And I know there's ways around that. You could go perhaps to a testing center and take an exam. And
so you're saying there's more opportunity for cheating then?
That's exactly right. And so that's I think that goes to the stigma.
Okay. So you said you think the stigma is no longer existent?
Yeah, I think it's hard to find an article in the past 2 years that really challenges the efficacy of an online modality versus a hybrid or a fully inline. Sure. Again, I think it does depend a little on the segments of student you're talking about.
Okay. Well,
but when you have every major research institution in this country, whether in Coursera or EDX, the Harvard-MIT consortium, offering an online learning with today's technology and faculty, I think that the ultimate arbiter of whether online has a stigma or not would be the people that consume the degrees. People that consume the degrees would be people who hire the graduates, would be U.S. businesses or global businesses. In global businesses, part of what I do is to interface a lot with U.S. businesses, and that stigma is gone.
I don't think I don't think it's the efficacy that's an issue with the stigma. I think it's, again, it has to do with ethics about, are these students on the up and up in terms of examination taking, and are those grades that are produced an actual reflection of their own grades? At the end of the day, both parties, one at online and say cheating, and one at a university, may still learn the material sufficient to produce the performance that they need to in whatever field or area that they may work. But the stigma, I think, has to do with specifically that.
There's technology coming online now to address that. I actually read an article this week where there are companies actually being formed that offer web monitoring, and you actually log in with credentials online, and they're actually viewing you taking your test.
Oh, wow.
And then there's biometric authentication, and of course there are proctor testing centers. It's an excellent point, and it's one that has to be addressed going
forward.
Well,
that's very good, and it's very good to hear that, but I still don't think that it changes the notion of elitism in American higher education, and that exists. Why is it that now that, it's funny because for years, the Harvards and those sorts of institutions like, no online, no for profit. Now they see that the opportunity for increased revenue, et cetera, is there, so they're hopping in. But once again, it's sort of still under this two-tier system of, if I get an online degree, if it's from Harvard, then it's much better. And I don't know if that's necessarily the case.
Harvard's long had that extension school.
Correct.
That's right.
They've long had that, which would they separate from the Harvard College.
Different brand.
Yeah, right, exactly. So when will the day come when this, because I have to disagree slightly with you on this. I do believe the stigma still exists. I believe in many of the traditional fields, our field, for instance, you can't find an online PhD in political science.
I mean, I think it varies by discipline.
So, but the point is that I do believe that the day is coming when that is not going to be the case any longer either. And I wonder when that's going to change, if it's ever going to change.
Well,
and maybe it won't.
We're a transition, don't forget. Once there are faculty that were trained totally online, these kids now that are 18, 19, 20 years of age and never went to a traditional school become faculty. I think 2 generations from now it'll be a lot easier. We're old school, let's face it.
Yeah.
And so that's part of the issue. We're comparing one paradigm with one that's slightly different.
Yeah.
But I don't know that issues of assessment and accreditation and accountability are going to go away. And I think that at the heart of all this, we're looking at academic programming and integrity, whether it's in cheating environments with students taking exams online or participating, or academic programming integrity, monitoring faculty, how faculty are teaching, what's going on in those classes, what demonstrates student learning. So I see that as another part of this puzzle. How we're going to rank those or figure that out.
Online can be quality-wise much higher because you can have everything videotaped, you can have people review it, you have a second, third, fourth generation online course, and it becomes more and more perfected.
And I do agree with you, and I think you make an excellent point, how their quality can be better because it can be more organization of material.
And consistency.
But I have to say this once again from my own personal experience, I did not think I was a good instructor online. I just didn't. I felt that the thing that I do best is connect with my students, and I really could never do that. And so I felt like something was always missing. And that was hard to get around.
I don't think there's a lot that can replace that personal interaction of what happens in a classroom when the student says something and you say something and another student says something and
right.
it feeds on as opposed to, you can't duplicate that in a chat room.
No,
you just can't do
especially
it.
for students that need extra
Right.
motivation.
But chat room you can do also more though, because I've been in chat rooms during the whole week,
Not
back
the,
and
not
forth on
the
my
personal-
phone.
immediate,
no,
not
not
the
the
immediate.
personal
On my phone,
motivational
answering,
touch.
responding immediately.
That's
You
not
can't.
always possible. It's not always possible.
Yeah.
Your responses are much more measured. They're not immediate
and-
reactions. The face-to-face,
yes.
the body
Much
language
gets
that
left
you
out.
get from a professor.
Yes, and it pulls out the inspirational
Right.
component to teaching.
I was just going to say, I think these are very valid points. One way that the University of Phoenix has tried to address this is we build in learning teams into our pedagogy. So there's groups of folks formed inside of a class. Our class size is 15 to 1. So groups of folks are formed in the class, small learning teams, 3-4 people, and they work together to solve problems. So we try to bring that social interaction together as best we can. And we built something 2 years ago. It's the world's largest online educational social network called Phoenix Connect. And what it allows someone to do, to your point, is if you're online at night and you're trying to learn something and you don't have an answer, the network connects you to anyone in the world who may be a student taking that same course. Maybe they're studying it in a different state or a different country, and can you connect to them? Can you build that sense of community? But it is an absolute challenge. And I go back to my opening comment. To your question is, are bricks and mortar dead? My answer is no, because it's all about segmentation and market needs. And the challenge for schools today, any school, regardless of your tax status, regardless of how big or small you are, regardless if you teach undergraduates or graduates or you teach working adults, is how do you make yourself relevant to that student and provide an educational niche? One statistic I read coming in this morning, Liberty University in Virginia, Jerry Falwell's school he founded, was a little small school 10 years ago.
Yep.
Today I read, they are the largest nonprofit private institution in the country. 74-ish thousand students, 60-something thousand are online.
Yep.
They came from nowhere. And I would argue, I've been there, I would argue that's because they offer a value. It's a niche. It's religious-based education. And people are reacting to that. They're willing to pay the price. They're willing to either go there for a residential experience, or they'll do it online. It's a great example of how the world's changing.
And I think it's a great place to stop. Thank you for bringing that up. I think it's a perfect example. I'm familiar with that university and a number like it. And if you look at it, you know, Harvard, Princeton, Yale started somewhere as well. Actually started with similar religious backgrounds. But I think it's interesting to see how this shift is happening. And, you know, it's changing right before our very eyes. And what we do is going to be significantly different even in 10 years. And so thank you for the conversation. It was very informative. And let's continue to inspire those students.
Thanks, Ted.
Thank you.
That's our show for today. But the conversation continues online right now at WYCC.org. We'll see you next time on The Professors.